Missing person investigations are complex and require a multi-agency approach. When all of these agencies work collaboratively, great progress is often made and those responsible are brought to justice. Sometimes, some cases are so complex that they go unsolved and leave experts baffled for years. Number 5. When Roy McCaleb met Carolyn Sue Kristen Wilson following the breakdown of his 22-year marriage, he thought he'd been given another chance at love. Little did Roy know that within a matter of years, he would be at the center of one of the most bizarre cold cases in Texas history. In 1985, Roy, aged 51, and Carolyn, 43, had been married for 2 years and the relationship seemed to be going steady. They shared a home in Houston, Texas, and in September of 1985, Roy had recently undergone spinal surgery and was taking some time out of his job as a construction foreman. Some sources state that Roy was also recovering from a heart attack, and because of his surgery, he'd been heavily sedated and given painkillers. As Roy was recovering in the comfort of his own home, tragedy struck, leaving the local community and Roy's family wondering who could be capable of such an act. On the evening of September 22, 1985, a call came in to the local police, and on the other end of the phone was a panicked Carolyn. She told dispatchers that a barefoot man had broken into their home and shot Roy. She explained to officers that she had knocked the weapon out of his hand, picked it up, and used it to defend herself, giving herself an alibi for the fingerprints and residue. She also told officers that the same man had assaulted her 10 days before, but was unable to give any further description of the man. Investigators set about looking for their suspect right away, with Carolyn cooperating wherever she could. Despite their best efforts, no suspects were found, and Roy's case quickly went cold. Roy's family and the local community never forgot about what happened to him, and hoped that in the near future justice would be served. 23 years later, the Houston Police Department decided to reopen the case and found something shocking. After re-examining the case, the Houston Police Department determined that Carolyn had been responsible all along, and that for 23 years she had been living a lie. Carolyn was promptly arrested. However, her attorney managed to convince District Judge Kevin Fine that too much time had passed and the charges would not be going forward. Thankfully, in 2012, the case was reassessed by a new judge who ruled that Carolyn could be indicted, and in 2013 she faced the courts. In court, she gave a full confession and entered a guilty plea, sparing Roy's family the further headache of a full trial. For her crimes, she was sentenced to 10 years probation and 6 months in prison. This sentence outraged Roy's family, who felt that the judge was far too lenient on her. Carolyn had recently been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and in conjunction with her guilty plea, her lawyers agreed to these terms due to her ill health. Number 4. In 1973, Elizabeth Carmichael stunned the world when she presented an invention that promised to revolutionize the motor industry and replace the gas-guzzling cars of the past. Elizabeth showed off her new invention that she called the Dale, a 3-wheeled car that could reportedly do 60 to 70 miles to the gallon and was made from aerospace plastic that offered drivers much more protection. When news of this invention hit the headlines, Elizabeth was inundated with pre-orders and companies wanting to get on board. She proudly stated that her car would cost consumers under $2,000 and that one could be reserved for $500. As 1973 rolled into 1974, Elizabeth had amassed $3 million in advanced sales and had started the 20th Century Motor Car Corporation to get the ball rolling with the production of the cars. Investors and consumers waited patiently for the big day. However, as months passed, people began to notice that something wasn't quite right. Investors were constantly pushed away from the factory, and it wasn't until the California Department of Motor Vehicles became involved that the house of cards came crashing down. Bill Hall, an investigator for the California DMV, went to the aircraft hangars that were turned into factories where the cars were apparently being produced. It also transpired that the 20th Century Motor Car Corporation didn't have the necessary permits and licenses to manufacture cars. With all of these discoveries, the authorities began closing in on Elizabeth and planned to expose her scam. With the authorities hot on her trail, Elizabeth packed up and moved to Dallas. Within weeks of being in Dallas, she moved again to Miami and tried her best to lay low. Behind the scenes, the authorities in California were preparing their charges against her, and she was finally caught and extradited to Los Angeles to face charges of conspiracy, grand theft, and fraud. During the trial, it was discovered that Elizabeth was a transgender woman whose previous name was Jerry Dean Michael, and that she was wanted by the federal authorities for counterfeiting and jumping bail in 1961 and 2. For years, Elizabeth appealed her sentence after being released on bail, but each time her request was denied. Then in 1980, she failed to show up for a court hearing, and the mystery deepened once more. Elizabeth was once again on the run, and investigators believed that they would never catch up with her. For 8 years, she was able to elude the authorities. That was until Unsolved Mysteries aired a segment about her case, and an eagle-eyed viewer called in a possible sighting. The witness claimed that Elizabeth Carmichael was living in Dale, Texas, under the name of Catherine Elizabeth Johnson. Authorities swarmed in on her home, and she was extradited to California once more. She was sentenced to serve 32 months in prison, and was released on parole after serving just 2 years. Number 3. In the early 1990s, Seattle's grunge scene was the place to be for budding musicians and those looking to have a good time. With the emergence of Nirvana, the Melvins, and Alice in Chains, the grunge scene was thriving and alternative music was on its way to the forefront of the public's consciousness. Young people flocked to Seattle, hoping to get a slice of the lifestyle and become a famous musician, just like Kurt and Mia Zapata, whose dreams were quickly becoming a reality. 27-year-old Mia Zapata was the lead singer in the band The Gits, who was touted as the next big thing in the grunge scene. Those who knew Mia described her as big-hearted and compassionate, a person people couldn't help but be drawn to. The Gits saw minor success in the scene, and their popularity was slowly rising. However, one night in July of 1993 changed all of that. Mia's case would go on to baffle investigators for years until a miraculous breakthrough came in 2002. On July 6, 1993, Mia spent the evening at the Comet Tavern, relaxing and socializing with her friends. At around midnight, she left the bar and headed for her ex-boyfriend's house. However, at the time, he was not home. Not wanting to waste the trip, Mia visited one of her friends who lived in the same apartment block. In July of 1993, the Gits were getting ready to go on another tour, and Mia wanted to make the most of the time she had in Seattle before hitting the road again. According to the friend, Mia left her apartment at around 2 a.m., telling her that she would get a taxi home. Unfortunately, Mia never made it home, and just over an hour later, her body was discovered in the 100th block of 24th Avenue South. Investigators were summoned to the scene and tried to piece together Mia's last known moments. It's unknown whether Mia got into a taxi after leaving the friend's house or not. Mia's friends were informed of the news, and the news of her passing sent shockwaves through the community. Mia was known as a well-loved, kind person who had a bright future ahead of her. Those who knew her were angry and confused and did everything they could to find the person responsible. Despite numerous interviews and forensic searches, no suspects were identified and Mia's case went cold. Then in 2001, the Seattle Police Department re-examined Mia's case and performed a forensic analysis on a sample collected from her body. A male's DNA profile was extracted and uploaded to CODIS, but there were no hits. That was until 2002, when the Seattle Police Department was alerted to a match 48-year-old Jesus Mezquia. Mezquia was sentenced to 37 years in prison and passed away in January of 2021. Number 2. 42-year-old Nancy Daddysman was going through a rough patch in her life. She had recently lost the custody of her 5 children following a difficult divorce, and thought that moving to a new area was the breath of fresh air that she needed. Despite the setbacks, Nancy remained positive and was looking forward to what the future held. On September 4th, 1998, Nancy hopped into her car headed for Indianapolis, planning to meet up with a friend. As she was making her way through Kentucky, she passed through the area of Bowling Green. Unfortunately for Nancy, her car broke down and she found refuge in a nearby Waffle House while she waited to figure out what she was going to do. While at the Waffle House, Nancy called her friend in Indiana, telling him what had just happened. She also told him that she had found a ride with someone. Unbeknownst to Nancy's friend, this was the last time that she was ever seen or heard from. When she failed to show up in Indiana and there was no sign of her in Kentucky, she was reported missing. It would take 2 years before Nancy's missing person case was finally solved, when 2 people at a roadside dump in Barron County, Kentucky found her skeletal remains. The authorities now knew what happened to Nancy, and now they had to catch up with the person responsible. With few leads to work with, the investigation quickly ran cold, and some investigators thought Nancy's case would never be solved. That was until 9 years later in 2009, when David Bell, a prisoner at the Indiana State Prison, made a startling confession. Bell told prison officials everything and provided information that only the perpetrator would have known. He also showed investigators defensive wounds that matched up with Nancy's injuries, and the fact that she fought back. At the time of his confession, Bell was serving a 65-year sentence for a similar crime he had committed in 2005. It's not clear if charges were ever brought against Bell in Nancy's case. He remains in prison and is eligible for parole in 2037. Number 1. 18-year-old Michelle Martinko was the apple of her parents' eyes and was adored by everyone who knew her. Michelle lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and when she wasn't working hard at school, she would often be participating in the twirling squad and school choir. Michelle had big ambitions, and after graduating from high school, she wanted to go to university to become an interior designer. The future ahead of her was bright, but sadly, that was taken away from her just before Christmas in 1979. Michelle's case would baffle investigators for over 40 years and led her family on a quest for justice. On December 19, 1979, Michelle went to the Westdale Mall and planned to pick up and pay off a coat her mother had reserved for her as a Christmas present. According to witnesses and employees, Michelle changed her mind about the coat at the last minute and decided to spend the money on other things instead. She also briefly met up with a few friends who were also shopping and grabbed some food before heading home. While she was with her friends, Michelle told them something chilling. She told them that she felt like she was being watched and was acting very paranoid. At around 9 p.m., Michelle left the Westdale Mall and headed for the car park. This would be the last time that Michelle was ever seen alive. When she failed to return home, Michelle's parents became extremely worried and called the police to report her missing. Hours later, at around 4 a.m., Michelle's body was discovered in her car, still parked in the mall's parking lot. Michelle had multiple injuries and had defensive wounds, and investigators hoped that the person responsible had left some clues behind. Luckily for investigators, the perpetrator had injured himself during the attack and left DNA behind on Michelle's dress and the gear stick of the car. It wouldn't be until many years later that this evidence could be tested for DNA, but investigators had obtained a small sample in 1979 and stored it away for future testing. Without any witnesses or clues, Michelle's case quickly ran cold, and investigators were left baffled as to who could have done something like this. Years passed, and it wasn't until 2005, when a new team was assigned to Michelle's case, that the investigation saw movement again. The DNA obtained from Michelle's dress and the gear stick were sent in for testing, and it revealed that it belonged to a man. The sample was subsequently run through CODIS, but yielded no matches. Investigators found themselves back at square one, but vowed to never give up. Then, in 2015, investigators reached out to Parabon Nanolabs, who were able to create a family tree through genealogical research. This led investigators to the Burns family, and after conducting a trash pull, they were able to test the DNA of Kenneth Burns, Donald Burns, and Jerry Burns against the DNA collected from Michelle's dress. Investigators held their breath, and finally, in 2018, they arrested 64-year-old Jerry Burns of Manchester, Iowa. At the time of the crime, Jerry was 25 years old and had lived as a free man for the last 39 years. Jerry was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison without parole. During his hearing, Jerry maintained his innocence and filed an appeal for a new trial, which was denied. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.